This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. Over the years, one of the most frequently asked questions surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's private island has been simple. Who actually visited Little St. James? The island, located in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was owned by Epstein from 1998 until his death in 2019. During that period, it functioned as one of several residences connected to his lifestyle and social network. Guests reportedly arrived by boat after traveling through nearby airports, most commonly on the island of St. Thomas. However, identifying visitors is not always straightforward. Unlike hotels or commercial properties, private estates rarely maintain publicly accessible guest registries. Instead, investigators and journalists rely on indirect documentation to reconstruct travel patterns. In the case of Little St. James, several types of records have helped researchers understand who may have traveled to the island over time. One of the most widely discussed sources is private flight logs associated with aircraft used by Epstein. These records document flights taken by Epstein's planes between locations such as New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Because travelers often flew into St. Thomas before continuing to Little St. James by boat, these logs have provided clues about potential visitors. But flight logs alone cannot confirm who actually reached the island. A person appearing on a flight record simply indicates that they were on a particular aircraft for a specific trip. It does not automatically establish where they stayed afterward or whether they visited Little St. James itself. Other sources also contribute to the documented record. Court filings, sworn testimony, and investigative reports sometimes reference travel between Epstein's various properties. In some cases, these documents mention visits to the U.S. Virgin Islands or describe events that allegedly occurred on the island. Together, these materials form a partial picture. They do not create a complete guest list, but they provide documented evidence that investigators and journalists have used to understand the movement of people within Epstein's network. This distinction is important. The difference between appearing in a record and being accused of wrongdoing is significant. Many individuals whose names appear in travel records have never been charged with any crime related to Epstein. The records simply show that travel occurred. Understanding that difference helps clarify what the available documentation can, and cannot, tell us about visitors to the island. Because when examining historical records connected to a complex investigation, context matters as much as the documents themselves. One of the most widely discussed sources used to identify possible visitors connected to Jeffrey Epstein's island is a collection of private flight logs. These records document trips taken by aircraft associated with Epstein over a number of years and have been examined by journalists, investigators, and legal teams attempting to understand travel patterns within his network. Flight logs are routine documents in aviation. Pilots record basic details for each trip, including departure and arrival airports, dates, and sometimes the names or initials of passengers. In the case of Epstein's aircraft, these logs covered flights between several locations connected to his residences and activities. Common destinations included New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. For travel connected to Little St. James, flights most often arrived at Cyril E. King Airport in St. Thomas. Because the island itself does not have an airstrip, visitors typically completed the final portion of the journey by boat. This travel route became a key detail when researchers reviewed the records. If a flight log showed a trip from the mainland United States to St. Thomas with Epstein or his associates on board, investigators sometimes considered it a possible connection to activity at Little St. James. However, the presence of a flight record alone does not confirm that a passenger actually visited the island. St. Thomas is a major transportation hub in the region. Many travelers arrive there for business, tourism, or travel to other nearby islands. As a result, appearing in a flight log connected to a trip to St. Thomas does not necessarily establish that someone went to Little St. James. Still, the logs became widely known when they entered the public record. During civil litigation and investigative reporting in the 2010s, portions of these flight records were reviewed and sometimes published by media organizations. Because the logs occasionally listed passenger names, they sparked significant public interest and speculation about who had traveled with Epstein. Some names appearing in the documents were well-known figures from politics, business, and entertainment. It is important to note that appearing in a flight log does not imply involvement in criminal activity. In many cases, individuals listed in the records have publicly stated that they were unaware of Epstein's misconduct or that their travel occurred for unrelated reasons. The documents simply show that flights occurred. They do not provide complete information about what happened after passengers arrived at their destinations. Yet despite these limitations, the flight logs became one of the most important sources used to reconstruct travel patterns within Epstein's network. And as more legal documents surfaced, additional types of records began contributing to that picture. As investigators and journalists tried to understand who might have traveled to Jeffrey Epstein's island, another major source of information emerged: court records. Civil lawsuits filed by victims and related legal proceedings produced thousands of pages of documents, including depositions, sworn testimony, and legal filings that sometimes referenced travel to Epstein's properties. These records became an important supplement to the flight logs. While aviation documents showed who might have traveled on Epstein's aircraft, court filings occasionally described where those travelers went after arriving. Testimony from accusers and witnesses sometimes mentioned Epstein's residences in several locations, including New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In some cases, the island of Little St. James appeared in these accounts. Depositions taken during civil litigation included statements from individuals who described trips to Epstein's properties or events that allegedly occurred there. Because these statements were given under oath as part of legal proceedings, they became part of the official record examined by attorneys, reporters, and researchers. However, interpreting these documents requires caution. A deposition reflects a witness's account of events, but it does not automatically establish that every detail has been verified in court. Civil cases often involve conflicting testimony from different parties, and the legal process can take years to evaluate those claims. Still, the documents provided important context. By comparing travel records, testimony, and timelines, investigators were sometimes able to reconstruct how certain trips occurred. For example, a flight record showing travel to the U.S. Virgin Islands could occasionally be matched with a statement from a witness describing an event during a similar time period. These connections helped build a broader picture of Epstein's movements and the locations associated with him. At the same time, many names appearing in legal records were not accused of wrongdoing. Some individuals were simply mentioned because they attended social events, visited properties, or had professional connections with Epstein at various points in time. This distinction remained crucial. Being referenced in a document connected to an investigation does not necessarily mean that a person participated in or was aware of illegal activity. Legal records often include a wide range of individuals who appear only because they intersected with the events being examined. Even with thousands of pages of documentation, the record remained incomplete. Private travel, informal gatherings, and activities at secluded properties do not always leave detailed documentation. As a result, investigators have had to rely on fragments of information to understand who visited the island and when. As legal documents and flight logs became public, investigative journalists began examining them in detail. News organizations spent years reviewing thousands of pages of court filings, aviation records, and property documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein's network. Through this process, reporters attempted to identify patterns in travel and determine which individuals might have visited locations associated with him. Journalistic investigations played a major role in bringing these records to wider public attention. Several major newspapers and investigative outlets published reports analyzing Epstein's travel network. These articles often compared multiple sources at once: flight logs, witness testimony, court documents, and public statements from individuals who had known Epstein socially or professionally. By combining these sources, journalists were able to reconstruct partial timelines of travel. For example, if a flight log showed Epstein traveling to the U.S. Virgin Islands on a particular date, reporters sometimes examined whether any legal testimony referenced events during the same period. This type of cross-referencing helped build a clearer understanding of how Epstein's properties were used and how people moved between them. Little St. James frequently appeared in these reports. Because the island had become widely associated with Epstein's activities, journalists focused on it as a key location when examining his network. Satellite imagery, aerial photographs, and maritime routes were also studied in order to understand how visitors might have reached the island after arriving in St. Thomas. Despite these efforts, the available information remained incomplete. Many private trips leave little or no public documentation. Guests may arrive on charter flights, private boats, or commercial airlines that do not publicly release passenger lists. As a result, even extensive investigations cannot produce a definitive list of every person who visited a private estate. Journalists repeatedly emphasized this limitation. Most responsible reporting focused on documented travel records rather than speculation. Names appearing in flight logs or court documents were usually presented with important context. Appearing in a record does not mean a person participated in illegal activity. Many individuals whose names surfaced in these investigations publicly stated that they had only limited contact with Epstein or were unaware of any misconduct at the time. The goal of these investigations was not simply to identify visitors, but to understand the broader structure of Epstein's social and travel networks. Who traveled with him? Where did those trips occur? And how often did people move between his different properties? Answering those questions required careful examination of every available document. Even so, the picture remained incomplete. As flight logs and court documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein became public, attention quickly turned to the names that appeared in those records. Some of them belonged to well-known public figures from politics, business, academia, and entertainment. Because of their prominence, their appearances in travel documents generated widespread media coverage and public debate. It is important to understand the context of these records. Many individuals interacted with Epstein long before the full scope of the allegations against him became widely known. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Epstein moved within social and financial circles that included politicians, investors, scientists, and celebrities. He hosted gatherings, attended conferences, and maintained relationships across several professional communities. As a result, travel records connected to his aircraft sometimes listed names that were already familiar to the public. In some cases, those individuals later acknowledged that they had traveled with Epstein or attended events where he was present. Others stated that their contact with him had been limited to specific meetings or flights and that they had no knowledge of illegal activity connected to him. These distinctions became central to the public discussion. Appearing in a flight log simply means that a person was recorded as a passenger on a particular trip. It does not confirm where that person stayed afterward, how long they remained in the region, or whether they ever visited Little St. James itself. Many people traveled to St. Thomas, the main airport serving the U.S. Virgin Islands, for reasons unrelated to the island. Tourism, business travel, and conferences frequently bring visitors to the area. Because the final journey to Little St. James required a boat transfer, a passenger arriving in St. Thomas could easily continue to another destination instead. Nevertheless, the publication of travel records sparked intense public curiosity. Journalists, researchers, and members of the public began studying the documents closely, attempting to identify patterns and connections within Epstein's network. Some individuals whose names appeared in the records issued public statements clarifying their relationships with Epstein or explaining the circumstances of their travel. Others chose not to comment. The resulting discussion highlighted a broader issue often seen in large investigations: the difference between association and accusation. A documented interaction, such as a meeting, flight, or social event, does not automatically imply participation in criminal activity. Investigators must rely on evidence and testimony to determine whether wrongdoing occurred. Understanding that distinction helps place the records in proper perspective. While travel documents provide valuable information about who moved within Epstein's network, they do not by themselves establish what took place during those visits. As investigators and journalists examined the available flight logs and legal documents, a central question emerged. How could travel records be connected to specific locations, including Little St. James? Because the island does not have an airport, every visitor had to complete their journey in multiple stages. Most travelers first arrived at Cyril E. King Airport in St. Thomas, the main transportation hub for the U.S. Virgin Islands. From there, the final leg of the trip to Little St. James was typically completed by boat. This two-step route made the investigation more complicated. A flight record showing a trip to St. Thomas did not automatically confirm that the passenger later visited the island. St. Thomas serves as a gateway to numerous Caribbean destinations, including nearby islands, hotels, and marinas. A traveler arriving there might continue on to many different places. To understand whether someone may have visited Little St. James, investigators sometimes relied on multiple overlapping records. For example, a flight log could indicate that Epstein's aircraft arrived in St. Thomas on a certain date. Investigators might then compare that information with other sources, such as witness testimony, maritime records, or statements made during legal proceedings. When different documents referenced similar dates or travel patterns, they sometimes provided stronger indications of where visitors might have gone. Even then, certainty was not always possible. Private estates rarely maintained publicly available visitor logs, and transportation by private boat may leave little formal documentation. As a result, many trips associated with Epstein's network can only be partially reconstructed through indirect records. Despite these limitations, investigators were able to identify certain patterns of movement. Flight records showed repeated travel between Epstein's residences in New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The frequency of these trips suggested that the island was regularly used as part of a broader network of properties rather than as an isolated retreat visited only occasionally. These patterns also helped explain why Little St. James became a focal point during later investigations. When authorities reviewed Epstein's travel history, the island appeared consistently within the broader timeline of his movements. Combined with testimony referencing events at multiple locations, this pattern helped investigators understand how the island fit within the larger structure of Epstein's activities. Still, many questions remained. Travel records could suggest connections, but they could not always reveal what occurred after visitors arrived. For investigators attempting to understand the full scope of events, the island represented both a documented location and a place where much of the activity remained hidden from public view. In 2019, when federal prosecutors filed new criminal charges against Jeffrey Epstein in New York, investigators began reviewing the network of locations connected to him. Among those properties, Little St. James drew particular attention because it had appeared repeatedly in earlier testimony and legal documents. The federal case focused primarily on alleged trafficking activity that prosecutors said occurred between the early 2000s and mid-2000s. However, understanding the scope of those allegations required investigators to examine the places where Epstein lived, traveled, and hosted guests. Little St. James was one of those places. Although the island had long been privately owned and rarely accessible to the public, it was widely recognized as part of Epstein's group of residences. When investigators reviewed travel records, witness statements, and earlier civil litigation, the island appeared often enough to justify closer examination. Shortly after Epstein's arrest in July 2019, attention began turning toward the U.S. Virgin Islands. Federal authorities worked with local agencies to coordinate investigative steps connected to properties associated with Epstein. News reports from the period described law enforcement personnel traveling to Little St. James as part of evidence-gathering efforts connected to the broader case. These actions included searches of buildings and surrounding areas on the island. Search warrants allow investigators to collect materials that may be relevant to a criminal investigation. Such materials can include digital devices, documents, storage media, and other items that could potentially support or challenge allegations presented in court. Because the investigation was ongoing at the time, detailed inventories of items collected during these searches were not fully released to the public. Nevertheless, the presence of federal investigators on the island confirmed something important. Little St. James had become an official investigative location within the case. This development marked a significant change in the island's history. For more than 2 decades, it had existed primarily as a secluded private estate visited by Epstein and his guests. By 2019, however, it had become a location examined by federal law enforcement as part of a major criminal investigation. Images of investigators arriving by boat quickly circulated in international news coverage. The visual contrast between the quiet tropical setting and the seriousness of the investigation helped turn the island into one of the most recognizable symbols associated with the Epstein case. Yet the investigation would soon face an unexpected turning point. In August 2019, the federal case against Jeffrey Epstein came to an abrupt halt. Just weeks after his arrest in New York, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Authorities later ruled the death a suicide. The event immediately changed the direction of the investigation. Because Epstein died before his trial could begin, federal prosecutors were no longer able to present their full case in court. A trial would have allowed investigators to introduce evidence, question witnesses, and build a detailed narrative of the alleged crimes. Without that process, many aspects of the case remained outside the formal courtroom record. For those attempting to understand who visited Epstein's island, this development was significant. A criminal trial often reveals extensive documentation, including travel records, communications, and testimony from multiple witnesses. In this case, the legal proceedings that might have produced such information ended before they could begin. However, the broader investigation did not completely disappear. Civil lawsuits involving Epstein's estate continued moving through the courts. Victims sought compensation through legal claims, and these cases generated additional documents, depositions, and testimony. Some of those materials referenced Epstein's properties, including Little St. James. At the same time, journalists continued investigating the story. Reporters reviewed existing flight logs, property records, and legal filings to better understand the network of individuals who had interacted with Epstein over the years. These investigations helped keep public attention focused on the island and the broader questions surrounding Epstein's activities. Another important development also emerged during this period. Federal prosecutors pursued charges against Ghislaine Maxwell, a longtime associate of Epstein who was accused of helping recruit and groom underage girls. Maxwell was arrested in 2020 and later tried in federal court. Her trial in 2021 resulted in a conviction on multiple charges related to sex trafficking and conspiracy. Although the trial primarily focused on Maxwell's role rather than Epstein's properties themselves, the proceedings added new details to the public record about how Epstein's network operated. Still, the question of who visited Little St. James remained difficult to answer with complete certainty. Travel records, testimony, and investigative reporting could reveal fragments of information, but without a full trial involving Epstein himself, some aspects of the timeline remained incomplete. Yet the story of the island was not over. In the years following Jeffrey Epstein's death, attention gradually shifted from the investigation itself to the future of the properties he once owned. Among them, Little St. James remained the most widely recognized. Because the island had become so closely associated with the Epstein case, questions emerged about what would ultimately happen to the property. Epstein's estate was responsible for managing his assets after his death. At the same time, the estate faced numerous civil claims from victims seeking financial compensation. Resolving those claims required the estate to evaluate and eventually sell some of its most valuable holdings. Little St. James was one of those assets. The island, along with the nearby Great St. James, was placed on the market. Together, the two islands represented a large portion of Epstein's real estate holdings in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Real estate listings described them as rare private island opportunities located just a short distance from St. Thomas. However, the islands carried a complicated history. Because of their connection to Epstein and the allegations surrounding his activities, the properties had become internationally recognized. Any future owner would inevitably inherit that association along with the land itself. In 2023, both islands were sold. Reports confirmed that investor Stephen Dekoff, through his investment firm, purchased Little St. James and Great St. James for approximately $60 million. The acquisition transferred ownership of the islands away from Epstein's estate for the first time since he originally bought Little St. James in 1998. The new ownership group announced plans to redevelop the properties. Public statements suggested that the islands could eventually become part of a luxury resort project designed to attract tourism and investment to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Such redevelopment would represent a major transformation from their previous use as private residential estates. Still, the legacy of the location remained a sensitive issue. Local residents, journalists, and observers around the world continued to view Little St. James through the lens of the Epstein investigation. Any changes to the property were expected to draw significant public attention. For those studying the timeline of the island, the sale marked an important turning point. The property had moved into new hands, but its history remained firmly connected to the events that had taken place there and the questions that investigators had tried to answer. And that brings us to the final part of this timeline. Today, Little St. James stands as a location that is both physically real and symbolically significant. Over more than 2 decades, flight logs, court filings, investigative reporting, and civil litigation have created a documented record of some of the individuals who traveled with Jeffrey Epstein. Yet the question of exactly who visited the island remains only partially answered. The available records offer valuable insights. Flight logs document travel on Epstein's private aircraft to locations including St. Thomas, the gateway to Little St. James. Civil court filings and sworn testimony sometimes reference trips to Epstein's residences, offering clues about who might have been present on certain dates. Investigative journalism has combined these sources to identify patterns of movement and recurrent visitors, illustrating how the island was integrated into Epstein's broader network. At the same time, the records have important limitations. Being listed on a flight log or mentioned in a deposition does not confirm that someone visited the island, nor does it imply wrongdoing. Many people listed in the records have publicly stated that they were unaware of Epstein's criminal behavior. Investigators, journalists, and the public must distinguish between documented travel and allegations of illegal activity. The island's role in the investigation also underscores the challenges of reconstructing events at private, secluded locations. Little St. James had no formal guest logs, and trips often involved private boats rather than commercial transport, leaving limited official documentation. Even with flight logs and testimony, only fragments of the timeline can be definitively verified. As a result, a full understanding of who visited, and what occurred during those visits, remains elusive. Yet the accumulated records reveal broader patterns. Repeated travel between Epstein's residences, the regular use of the island, and the presence of multiple documented visitors demonstrate that Little St. James was more than a private retreat. It was an active part of Epstein's network. The location consistently appeared in legal filings, journalistic reports, and federal investigations, highlighting its significance within the timeline of Epstein's activities. Finally, the sale of the island in 2023 marks a new chapter. While ownership has changed, public interest and scrutiny continue. The symbolic legacy of Little St. James remains connected to the documented records of travel and visitation, as well as to the broader narrative of accountability, investigation, and historical memory. In conclusion, the question, who visited the island, can be partially answered through careful analysis of flight logs, court filings, and reporting. Yet many details remain unknown, leaving Little St. James as a documented yet enigmatic location, a site that continues to shape the public understanding of Jeffrey Epstein's network and the enduring search for transparency. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.